Welcome to the BLC Podcast, a ministry of Bethlehem Lutheran Church, ELCA, St. Cloud, Minnesota. On today's very first episode of the podcast, Chad and I will be discussing the reasons why many of us have different views on God, the Bible, faith, creation, and basically life itself. And it all stems from how we read and understand the Bible. So here we go. Wherever you find yourself listening, we hope that it can add some life, some perspective, maybe a few laughs, and some good food for thought as you travel down the road of life. Thanks for listening. The Lord be with you.
All right. Well, Matt, hi. How are you doing?
Welcome. Good to be here.
Excellent. So to all of our Bethlehem friends out there, this is a podcast, but not another sermon type podcast.
Oh, no.
We want this to be a little bit different. So this is the first attempt that we are making in coming up with some digital content that you can listen to in your cars, because we have done a variety of topics before in person, which have been very highly, we got some good feedback on.
Yeah, I think people saw that, experienced that, and said, we want kind of more of that content. We want to hear more from Chad. We want to go deeper. And so I'm just kind of here to be that voice, to be like, to mine the depths of Chad's wisdom and maybe offer a few nuggets of joy myself.
Yeah. I mean, and so it's going to be a podcast really just on a variety of topics that are pertinent to religious life in America, in particular, some of the things that we're dealing with right now here at Bethlehem and in the St. Cloud community. And yes, Matt's here, and we'll have other people on from time to time, but we wanted you to be able to take us with you in the car or on a walk or at the gym or some other place. I don't know if people listen to these kind of podcasts at the gym.
I tend to just listen to them in the car on my way here, because I have quite the drive to get here. So,
I do not listen to this at the gym, because that would be like the worst workout ever if I did that.
Yeah, I tend to I don't listen to many faith podcasts myself, though, because I work at a church. I get a lot of faith. I bring my faith with me everywhere I go. Sometimes I'll mine some good faith podcasts, but usually I'm more in the entertainment realm of podcasting.
Yeah, and for me, I actually do listen to a few, because in particular, they're I don't know if I would call them faith podcasts.
Yeah.
Because right now there's a lot of 21st century kind of conversation around Christian deconstruction, people who have had faith, who don't have faith anymore, or their faith is changing, or they've had a really negative experience with organized religion.
Yeah.
And it's a whole different landscape out there. And there's a lot of people talking about, how do I even have faith?
Mm-hmm. I think that's fascinating to me. Just how do you have an honest faith in nowadays, where it's like, are you allowed to have questions, like as you're looking through the Bible or hearing messages and stuff, you get two different messages. There's two different types of Christianity out there, it seems like.
Oh, I think there's even more than that.
Well, yeah, of course, there's way more than that, but like, it's just you're either all in 100%, like, the Bible is 100, and we'll get into this a little bit, I think, in our podcast today. 100% accurate. There's nothing wrong with it. Take it word for word, or you're, the other camp, where you look at a lot more of the context and all the historical stuff, and we'll probably get into that too today in this episode here. But how do you have just an honest faith today and not get judged for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a lot of people are trying to figure out, and can I? And I think it's not even being judged for it. It's being authentic to oneself, because there's a lot of people that I know who wake up in the morning and can no longer go, well, I think I'll go be a part of a faith community today and feel good about myself. They say, I've been having questions for a long time. I don't know if I can do this anymore. It feels disingenuous to be a part of a faith community when I don't think I believe this stuff anymore. And what I find interesting is, like, when people say, well, I don't think I have faith anymore, I don't believe in God, I want to say, well, what kind of God? Tell me about the God you don't believe in.
Right.
Like, because I want to know. In the same way, when people say, I don't know if I trust that the Bible is like God's word anymore, I'm like, well, what do you mean when you say that?
Yeah. Because
more than likely, I'm going to agree a lot with what you have to say.
Absolutely.
But I think that's our topic for the day, because I mean, we wanted to get into this question when Matt and I were talking about, well, what should our first podcast be about? Like, what should we have a conversation about? And it was about
Jesus.
Yeah. more than Jesus, more than the Sunday school Jesus. It was really about the Bible as a whole, because I think this is where a lot of people like start their questions. They start their journey to either deconstructing their faith, or it's such a linchpin for so many people, because or for their faith, for their understanding of faith, because Christians have fought about slavery and female church leaders and homosexuality and baptism practices and communion and heaven and hell and so many other things.
Just to name a few.
Solely based on how they understand the Bible.
Yeah. Have you seen the movie Saved?
The Macaulay Culkin movie?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes. Have you?
It's been a while, but I've seen it. I remember it. I remember how they were using faith as a weapon.
Yeah.
Do you remember that scene?
Yeah.
They actually, what do they do with the Bible in that scene, Chad?
Well, they're in school. So I think that, the movie is set up where you have the, kind of evangelical, very conservative, people may call them like, Bible thumpers, or those kind of,
right.
that kind of terminology.
You'd be surprised to find that Mandy Moore plays one of those characters.
Yeah. And she is, I forget her interaction with another student who doesn't buy her version of Christianity.
I think she's trying to, quote unquote, save the backsliding Christian, the one who is losing her faith and sliding into the pits of the fires of hell, and she's going to go save her, have a form of exorcism in account.
There we go.
It's insane.
So she takes, I do remember this part though. So she's having this conversation and it doesn't go well. She takes her Bible out and she quotes her Bible, and then I still don't think it's going well. And so then she literally throws it at her like a weapon.
Throws it at the back of this girl. This poor girl is just trying to get through life, and she turns around. It has a great line after that though. I remember she says, "The Bible is not a weapon."
Yeah.
Like literally Mandy Moore is just dumbfounded. It's a good movie. I need to go back and rewatch that one, because I think it's a good example of what you're talking about here.
Right. But I think many of us have examples of this where we've been in a situation, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a former, person we've met at church, but somebody somewhere somehow says something about like, well, how can you think that? Don't you believe the Bible? Don't you have faith in what the Bible says? And I just like, well, what do people mean when they say that? How do we understand the Bible? Do people even know where we get this thing from?
Yeah.
And those are really key components of faith. And here's my premise, like, if more of us ask that question, where does this come from? How do we have it? How do we read it? I honestly think, it's a wishful thought, but I think that there would be far less anger, far less contention, far less, all the negative stuff that Christianity tends to bring up, because it all stems, I think, from how people understand their Bibles in which they read.
Yeah, that. But like, I come from a place where like I have this faith, and it's a strong faith, and my understanding of the Bible and stuff is not judgmental, and it's coming from a place of love and understanding, but like then people find out, like, if I'm Christian or whatever, oh, you're a Christian, like, oh, you must hate me, you must judge me because of this, that, or the other, and so like they have that view of Christians being super judgmental, this, that, or the other, everything is literal, blah blah blah. They automatically put you in that category, it seems like, and they don't realize that that's not where I'm at all.
Right.
Like, I'm very open to where you're at in your faith. And I remember having conversations with an atheist at Stirling University in Stirling, Scotland, when I was there for a year. And I was having a conversation with atheists, and kind of like you said earlier, like, he was telling me his views of what God was. And I was like, I don't necessarily believe in that God either. Like, I actually remember having that conversation with him. Like, I don't believe in that God either. Like, I think God's very different than that. And that was kind of the start of our conversation.
Right. And I think, again, we get these different ideas of who God is because of how we understand the Bible, because that is, for Christians, how do we understand God? Well, we understand God through the sacred text that we read, which is, the Hebrew and the New Testament scriptures that we have in our Bible. So that's what people will always default to. But when you read it, or when I read it, or when someone else reads it, you can get very different things.
Yeah,
and that's the question, right?
And I've been to a couple of Noah's Ark exhibits, and I've found out through those that, did you know, Chad, that dinosaurs were on Noah's Ark?
No way.
Yeah, there were T-Rexes literally running around eating all of the lambs.
Where did you see this at?
Oh, that was it no longer exists anymore. But when I lived in Orlando, Florida, they had something called the Holy Land Experience. And it was literally like Disneyland, but the Holy Land. And it was fascinating.
Well, I mean, you're aware still, though, of, is it Kentucky?
Yeah.
Like, where is...
There is a Noah's Ark exhibit
Correct.
now, like
They've
rebuilt the Ark.
There's a couple of them. They're in all, I think, in the Bible Belt of the country. But yes, they rebuilt this Ark, and it's an amusement park kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
And it attracts thousands of people every year.
Yeah.
And it's based on a literal reading of Genesis.
Yep.
And very much. And again, you can go back and remember the school arguments about, creationism versus evolution and all this good stuff. And where does all that have its roots at? How we understand the Bible. It's that first book of the Bible in Genesis. And how do we understand creation stories? And do you understand them as literal day creation, stories, or do you understand it more differently than that? And that's so interesting.
I like to think that after God created the dinosaurs, he was like just having fun, like a kid playing in the bathtub, and and he saw what he created was like, whoa, hold on here. Once I create humans, there's no way they're going to be able to exist together. And so he's just like chucks a meteor at him.
And that is the story of how the dinosaurs went extinct, right?
That was the prequel to the Bible. No, I've no. But okay, that's just me being goofy. But perhaps you could talk about the inerrancy versus the historical critical method.
Yeah.
So those are two ways to view the Bible. Am I pronouncing that right? Inerrancy. Inerrancy versus
without error.
Without error versus the historical critical method of looking at the Bible.
Yeah.
Because those are two kind of things I think that people might not know or realize that you can do.
Right. And so this is kind of like the meat of this today. So for some people, and you can find this in a lot of, just go to a church's website. This could be a fun little experiment for people if you're absolutely bored, have nothing else to do, and you want to know a little bit more about a particular church you're going to go visit. But go to their website and see what they believe, and almost always they will have something related to how they understand Scripture or the Bible. And for many of them, they will say, we believe that the Word of God or the Bible is without error, that it is historically accurate when it comes to, all things, that you can find in there. So basically, it's this idea, inerrancy is without error, so that everything that you read in the Bible is put there by God, inspired to be there by God. And that includes all the history that's a part of that. That includes everything. So when it's said that God created, the world
in 7 days.
In 7 days or 6 days and rested on the seventh day, that's a literal understanding of that.
24 hours.
Absolutely, all of that. And when the Gospels are writing about Jesus, and Jesus went up to this person and said this, that is literal. Like Jesus really did walk up to somebody and say, quote unquote, these exact words to that person. So that is basically, the Bible says it, I believe it, the end of story.
And it's kind of like, don't question, right?
And you don't question it. Well, why would you? Because it's the Word of God, and you take that incredibly seriously, and it's without error. God said it. It's written down. I believe it. This is the end of the story, and we don't question it, because that would be...
Yeah, even if there's something taught differently in the Old Testament than what Jesus said in the New Testament, which contradict each other, I don't know.
Well, but what people will do, though, is that they'll do some kind of mental gymnastics to get around all that.
Right.
And so even if you were to point out, different things, so, you have, even if the stories are the same in two Gospels, like the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, they happen in different books, and they take place in two different contexts, and the teachings are slightly different. And even though they're really basically the same, very similar in the story, somebody will say, well, those are two different things. Jesus did it twice. So this author records it here, this author records it there. They're not in contradiction to each other. It just happened twice. Just happened twice. So there's a lot of ways of looking at that and going, oh, well, that's how this works. And people do that all the time, and are able to pretty much continue to do what they need to do to make that narrative fit for them. So the problem is with that is that there are some things that you can't do that with.
Yeah.
If you're
what, for instance?
Well, if you're going to take the Bible really seriously, it's hard to reconcile. I'll give you some easy examples, and then, boy, I don't know how boring I want to get.
Start with the easy stuff for me.
Well, so really quickly here. So even with the creation stories, you have Genesis 1, Genesis 2. You have an order of creation in Genesis 1. That's not the same order as in Genesis 2.
Yeah, they're kind of different stories.
They are different stories.
Right from the beginning, you have two different contradicting.
If you're going to take it in the exact order and then you compare them, they're different. And if you're going to say this is inerrant without error already in the first two chapters, you're going to find yourself going, what is going on here?
Wait a sec. What's going on?
And even some of the big stories about Jesus, where Jesus' family is from. My favorite example to lift up for our confirmation students, we always do this every year, is, okay, it's Christmas pageant time. What's the story of Jesus' birth and where were Mary and Joseph coming from? Because according to different gospels, they come from different places. One, they're traveling in Luke, they're traveling from Bethlehem to Nazareth. And there's that whole story of the star and all those kinds of, going to Bethlehem and the story from Christmas pageants. But then you have Matthew, and there is no journey to Bethlehem because they're already there, and Jesus is essentially assumed to be born at home because, well, that's where they live.
It's in Matthew, right, where he starts with the lineage of all the...
Yeah, and again, it's just different. There are different stories, and you can't reconcile that. Same thing when Jesus dies, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Jesus dies after they eat a Passover meal together, him and his disciples. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus actually dies before that as they're slaughtering the lambs for Passover. So the question is okay, so Jesus can't die twice. Jesus, family can't be from both Bethlehem and Nazareth. So if these details are off, then the other side of the coin goes, well, can I believe anything in there then?
Right. I've heard it kind of talking about this exact thing before in the Gospels and the differences you find in the different Gospels and stuff. And I heard something that I found quite helpful with that.
Yeah, go.
And maybe this falls in the historical critical method of thought. But
we're getting there.
But the thought was, and I can't remember who said it or what, but it was if you asked 4 or 5 different people to describe a mountain, take a hike up the mountain or whatever, and they all went on different trails or they saw the mountain from different perspectives, they're going to describe that same mountain 100% differently. One of them is going to talk about the trees. The other one's going to talk about the animals. The other one's going to talk about the wind or whatever. And they're all going to have their perspective of experiencing the exact same mountain. And it's going to be written 4 different ways.
Yep.
And so the idea was that that's kind of what the writers did with Jesus. They all brought their context, their experiences with Jesus, or in their research of Jesus and asking people about him and the stories that were around at the time, because they were all shared. They weren't written down right away. They were just shared.
Right.
And so they took all of that stuff and then started writing it down. And so, and is there not more than 4 actually accounts? I haven't really gotten into the other writings at the time, but
yeah, and so yes, there are other gospels, so to speak. There's a lot of books that don't make it into the Bible that we have now that were absolutely used as authoritative sources in the early church communities.
Yeah.
People think about, well, haven't we always had 66 books in the Bible? The answer is, well, we've had that for Protestants have had that for a very, very long time. But in the early centuries of Christianity, there were many different sources that people were utilizing. So yeah, I mean, so then here's the other way of reading this, though. So Matt, so like you have this very literal way, and that's often how many of us learn to read the Bible. But then there's this deeper way of looking at it, this historical critical method, which just basically says we take history seriously and we take the fact that there are different forms of literature out there. So a psalm is a psalm. A gospel is a gospel. That is a type of literature. An apocalypse is a type of literature. And we don't try to make it all like history. So a way of looking at that would be like if we took a historical fiction book that's just written by, I don't know, an American author. Like, I don't know. I ask people like in high school now, like, do you read Huck Finn? And they're like, who's Huck Finn?
Yeah, right.
So nobody reads that stuff anymore. So my references sometimes don't work. But Huck Finn's a great example of this as a story, because if you read it, it sounds like it is a true story, right? Because it takes place in the South. It takes place, in the time of slavery. It explores the relationship dynamics of a white boy and a black man. It's a really interesting book, but it never happened. It's complete fiction.
Whoa, wait.
You right? You think that was but it never happened.
I'm learning so much from you right now, Chad.
It never happened.
What?
But what we learn from it, though, is nonetheless an important lesson. It's very true.
Right. There's still truth found within that.
Right. We don't read it like a newspaper, and yet it is still valuable for us. So like a gospel is a good news proclamation. It is not history. It's meant to give the reader good news. And in this case, the early Christians stole that concept from the Romans, really, and used it to apply it to Jesus. And there's good news about Jesus, and they tell you the story of this good news. And it's crafted as a gospel proclamation. It's not crafted as a history paper. It's not a biography on Jesus. And, as the newspaper reporter, I don't know, nobody reads newspapers anymore. It's not like it's a television reporter or a podcaster walking around following Jesus and going, and now Jesus is walking up to the leper, and we are looking at
the lumber?
The leper.
Oh, the leper. I thought you said the lumber.
Not the lumber. And Jesus is walking up to the leper, and looks like he is doing something. It looks like, oh my gosh, he's putting his hands on the... That's not how these things came together.
Ew, he raised him from the dead. Ew, he smells bad.
But people want to read it like that, though, and
right.
Again, it's not necessarily the way. It's not what the authors are interested in. There's a literary context and there's a historical context. It was written for a particular people in a particular place in a particular time using a particular form of literature.
Yep.
And we can learn about that and then apply those lessons and those ideals to us right now.
Which that has helped me out a lot when I've studied the Bible, is to go into and try to find the context. Where were the people at the time when this was written, when this story was written? What were the truths that, God was trying to communicate? And it's always usually takes them from a place of, if you look at it like from today's context, you look at it and go, wow, that was really an old way of thinking or really, but for them in that time, it's like, no, they were going a lot deeper. God was taking them deeper. You might not get that if you just look at it from today's, if you just go back there and without the context of which it was written and what the writer was trying to communicate at that time. Like for instance, the creation story, there's a lot of different creation stories.
Yep. And
you were saying, and one of the teachings I think with the kids, that a lot of the creation stories was that creation was bad.
Yeah.
Creation was bad.
Absolutely.
But in the Bible, it was a different creation story.
The Babylonian creation story, which predates the creation story in Genesis, the Enuma Elish, is a story that creation comes about through violence.
Yeah.
And that was a well-known story. I mean, it's not like people didn't know it. And that's what makes Genesis so interesting, is that the people of Israel, the biblical writers, crafted a creation story that is directly in contrast. It sends a different message. It speaks a different message than the one that was out there. And that was very intentional. Instead of creation being an accident or being bad, creation is intentional and it's good.
Yeah.
And that changes your mindset completely when you're asked about, well, how do you understand the earth and your place on it? Is it an accident? Is it bad? Is it something that you are trying to get rid of or leave behind?
Yeah.
Or is it something that is good and holy and precious to God, and we care for it?
And that's something you get when you study the context of it, and some of the and that's, I would much rather get that truth out of the creation story, that I'm good, that God created me and he thinks I'm good and that he loves his creation, and rather than he just did it in 7 literal days. Okay, I believe that. I checked that off.
Yep.
My can I go to heaven yet list. Like, it's, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's one of these. I think, again, everybody has a story. Not everybody. I have many stories where people, because of how they read the Bible, make certain judgments on you, or believe that they have to save you, or believe the Bible can be used as a manipulative tool. So for the average person, then, like, if you're not going to be the person who...
I'm average.
You're the average person. So I went to school for all this stuff, and I find it to be interesting, but I'm also kind of that church nerd person. But there's plenty of people who I think want to go deeper but don't know how to go deeper, or the resources to go deeper. And they're not going to do this very formal kind of educational kind of method to learn all of this. So what do you do, right? Like, how do you possibly make sense of any of this stuff? Is it even worth reading anymore? And I think it is, because I think there's ways of looking at the Bible. You can read it devotionally. And what I mean when I say that is, you don't need to worry about knowing all of the history, all of the literary context, all of the details that go into it. You can simply read it with an open mind, knowing that there is much more beyond than what you're reading.
Right.
And I think that there is value in that. There's value in asking the questions as you're reading devotionally. What is the author saying? Who are the characters? How are they operating? Where is there good news in this? Does it give hope? Where does hope come from? What am I learning? What does it say about being human? These are all really important ways or questions to be able to bring to the biblical story.
Absolutely.
As you're reading it.
What book would you say, if someone's trying to be like, I like to start a little more devotional time or reading the Bible, what book would you say they should start in?
That's a good question. So for me, I like narrative. I like story. I think human brains are we're story people. We relate to stories. And so because of that, I mean, I always say start with the gospel stories, because they literally are narrative stories.
Yeah.
There is a plot line. They're moving a direction. They're not wisdom literature. It's not poetry. It's not any of that can be a little bit dry and hard to make sense of. Sure. But that's where I go, to be able to start reading the gospel stories, the story of Jesus, and just begin to ask some of those questions that you have. And I think making lists of questions that you get while you're reading these texts, those are fantastic ways to go deeper into that. Yeah. You don't have to answer them. Right. Just living in the question, I think, can help anybody develop their spirituality.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Yeah, I like that. That's good advice. So you can read it devotionally on your own. Yep. Do you find value in doing it on your own, or finding like a group to do it alongside with?
You can do groups, because so again, here's another quick little story for you. I think groups of people are important, because when we talk about context, we have modern contexts. Right. Like, because I am a white middle to upper middle class male living in the Midwest, that just puts me in a particular worldview, as opposed to if I was a black female living in South Africa. Sure. I mean, our context is different. We see the world differently based on where we live. and we bring that context to the biblical story. And so when we read the same story, you might read it and go, wow, this is where I see myself. And I read it from a different context and go, well, that's fascinating. I didn't see that. Here's where I see myself in this story. And I think we both then can benefit from the other person's perspective on that.
Yeah.
So you can read it with people. I think that's always great. You can also read it by yourself. That's also fine. But I would encourage people just to try to make that a practice, whether that's at night or in the morning, because at Bethlehem, we talk a lot about that the story of our faith grounds us and how we see the world and ourselves and others. And there's a lot of people who I think that story is really not part of their personal stories. And it's an easy way, if you just make it a habit, to just begin to make take a step deeper into the story.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think I just wanted people to know, how do we have such differences? Well, because to oversimplify it, you have this literal interpretation, and then you have one that looks at the historical, critical way of looking at that.
Yep.
And you're never going to become on the same page. It's hard. You can't hold both. You really can't. You either hold one or the other.
To that point.
Here's what I'd like to do. I think maybe to end it up,
Yes.
This would be kind of fun. I'm curious, because we're going to do different topics, and we kind of want your input on this, because it's something that we're just trying out this year in different ways. And I love to know what topics you would like us to kind of talk about and cover. And if you are a person who reads the Bible devotionally, and what questions do you have that we might be able to pop on and just talk a little bit about and explore? And I would love to get your insight as far as what you'd be interested in topically, and if there's any questions people have just on the Bible in general.
Yeah, send those to your email, would you say?
Yeah, I think so.
That sounds good. What is your email?
cpeterson@bethlehemlutheranchurch.org. You can find it on our website.
As in C, as in the letter C, not the ocean C.
Correct.
In case anyone's wondering. Okay. Well, does that wrap up our very first episode here?
I think so. I think we got there.
We talked about some stuff.
We talked about a lot of stuff.
Talked about some Bible stuff. We talked about God and Jesus.
Not sure if it's going to be that interesting to everybody, but this was kind of fun.
Well, it's something for us to do anyway. So, let us know what you think. And we'll go from there and see how it goes.
All right.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
See ya.
Bye. Well, there you have it, our first episode of the podcast. Please do send us your thoughts and ideas for the topics to either Chad or myself. Chad's email is cpeterson@bethlehemlutheran.org, and my email is mmetz@bethlehemlutheran.org. You might just hear your idea talked about on the next episode. We appreciate you listening. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.